More and more of these Linear Conchords are turning up on eBay these days. People are buying them hoping they'll be a good guitar head. They're assuming that because it was made in the 60s it must have all that classic 60s guitar tone. The Linear Conchord was manufactured in the early 60s at the Electron Works in Armley. Most of the products that were made in the factory were sold through the R.S.C chain of shops. The amps were generally sold by other companies and also had different control panels designed for this purpose. Sony used the name Golden Air. R.S.C had their own name on them. And these products were also sold directly by Linear through mail order. If you bought one directly, you could also buy the amp in a kit form, which you could assemble yourself. The amps came in different models. The most popular one seen today on eBay seems to be the Linear Conchord, a 30-watt model, and also the Linear L50, and that was a 50-watt model. Both the output ratings are optimistic, as the output transformers were not the most powerful, probably the cheapest ones that they could buy at the time. The amps were considered a one amp for all purposes, a sort of jack of all trades. What this meant is that compromises were made in order to fit all these needs. To explain, let's talk guitar amps. Guitar amps are strange creatures. They're not like other amps. For example, audio amps are designed for reproducing music and are expected to do that accurately. They reproduce the original sounds of the record or tape, giving some control over the tone and the volume. But they're not expected to distort, as this would sound terrible. And the tone circuit is expected to sound natural, faithful to the original material, and not to colour the original sound. Guitar amps, on the other hand, are totally different. They sculpt the sound in ways that are unique to guitar amp circuitry. They're expected to add good sounding distortion at higher volumes, and all this is desirable to get that rock and roll sound that guitarists really crave. The tone circuit, often called a tone stack, is designed to work in conjunction with electric guitar pickup. These are very different in nature from turntable cartridges or other hi-fi type input signals. Tonally, guitar pickups boost the mid-frequencies of the sound. Guitar amp tone circuits adapt to this by being scooped out in the mid-range. This gives a more even response to the guitar pickup and does not allow the mids to dominate the sound. Fender, Marshall and other designers all design their tone circuits to do exactly that. The Linear Conchord and its brothers and sisters have a different tone circuit. It's called a Baxandall tone circuit. This circuit is identified usually by having two tone controls, a bass and treble. The Baxandall circuit has a flat response, which means that if you play guitar through it, the middle frequencies will dominate, and that sounds a bit wrong. Actually, the Linear amps generally sound quite flat and quite bassy, a little bit lifeless, in my opinion. If you turn up the Linear amp, the distortion doesn't really happen until quite late, and the amp has to be pushed very hard, and the distortion isn't very smooth. This is because the amp has a negative feedback loop. This is part of the electronic circuit that is supposed to stop the amp distorting. It's useful for playing back recorded music and for public address speaking, and so one might argue that this amp is good for bass guitar and organ too, as you'd want a clean signal. And there it is. As the amp stands, it's probably better for bass and organ than guitar. So if I want to use it for guitar, what can be done? Well, the tone circuit is a good place to start. Baxandall tone circuits are used in some other guitar amps. Ampeg have used them, Matt Amp and Orange Amps have used them to good effect, but they are voiced for guitar. So if you buy a Linear amp on eBay for guitar, you might want to voice it for guitar. In other words, you'd need to change the resistors and capacitors around the tone controls for more suitable values, and this would be a good place to start. Removing the negative feedback loop would also give you a better distortion and a slightly louder amp. So what's the situation with buying these amps on eBay? I've seen Linear amps on eBay for weeks with the Buy It Now for £180, and all the seller tells you is that it's been in the loft for 30 years and the valves glow when it's plugged in. Well, firstly, why is the seller plugging the amp in? You can be sure the seller hasn't connected it to a speaker. This is the worst thing you can do for a vintage amp, plugging it in without a speaker attached. This is the best way to destroy the output transformer. And while the seller sets up his camera and takes those telling photos and fiddles about with the camera exposure, your soon to be yours lovely amp is frying itself to death. And these transformers are not readily available today. You'd have to buy a replacement, and they are expensive. As a seller, what have you learned by plugging it in? Nothing really. You've learned that the power transformer is capable of producing 6.3 volts to light the tube filaments. This says nothing about the condition of the amp, the condition of the tubes, or anything else. These old amps should really be powered up slowly with a variac and a dummy load attached. This is the only way to really power up these old barn-find amps. The linear amps are now 50 years old, so are all the components. So what does that mean to the buyer? Well, it's likely you'll need to replace all the electrolytic capacitors. They may reform with a variac, but replacement is probably best and safest. You will likely find that many of the other capacitors have drifted in value and need replacing. Most of the resistors are likely to be out of tolerance and will need replacing. I recently purchased a Linear Conchord and needed to replace all but one resistor. Everything else was outside the 20% margin. So what's the good news? Well, take a look at the pictures of the amp before you buy. It's likely that the output transformer and the power transformer are originals. They are both grey with bell covers and look similar in shape on the L50. On the Conchord, the output transformer is on its side. Hopefully the volume and the tone controls will be okay after a clean, and your tube sockets will probably be okay. Hopefully your tubes will be okay. There should be 2 EF86s, 1 EC83 and 2 EL34 power tubes. Make sure you see the 2 valve covers for the 2 EF86s. The original valves were mullards. Sometimes they were labelled Pinnacle. These are robust valves and they sound very good. So if the amp's been sitting in a loft, that means the tubes haven't been used during this time, and that's a good thing. Expect some rust on the chassis. These were pressed steel chassis painted grey. They rust over time. The amps originally came with steel covers. These are also grey with 2 chrome handles on the top, left and right. This style is now called the bird cage design. It was once rather old-fashioned, but now it's quite trendy. What can you expect to pay to restore the amp? If you want to restore it so that it will last another 50 years, you'll need to replace most of the components under the chassis. The parts on the top will probably be okay. My Linear Conchord was the first amp I rebuilt, and it was the one that got me started in electronics. I also have a video about that on YouTube. It was not an easy project for a beginner. I probably should have started on a Fender Champ or something simple. There are proper guitar amps on eBay within the reach of what these will cost to restore. There are probably better value for money amps out there too. I would never pay more than £40 to £50 for one, given all that's involved in fixing them up. However, if the work has already been done, they are worth more, and they are also a piece of British amp history. The R.S.C. A10 was my first serious amp back in the late 70s. It was very much like a Conchord, but with different valves. I never had anything done to it, and I always felt it was rather bassy, but it was still quite loud. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope that it's been useful and it's answered some of your questions. Good luck looking for these amps on eBay. Please leave a thumbs up. Please leave a comment. I'd be happy to answer. And thanks very much for your time.